here for our final episode, at least for a while, on Mexican Drug Trafficking Organizations. In this segment, I will try to cover some cartels not yet covered in previous episodes in this series. The Beltran-Leyva Organization was a Mexican cartel active from at least the mid-1990s. It was headed up by 5 Beltran-Leyva brothers, Marcos Arturo, Carlos, Alfredo, Mario Alberto, and Hector. Originally, it started out as being an arm of the Sinaloa cartel, operating in the northern and eastern part of Sinaloa. But they were also active in the Mexican states of Morelos, Guerrero, Quintana Roo, Oaxaca, Chiapas, Nayarit, and Michoacan. Basically, they had a deal with Chapo Guzman and Mayo Zambada to stay out of their territories, basically stay out of each other's way and not compete. But later on, that deal soured. The Beltran-Leyva Organization, occasionally dressed as the BLO, controlled numerous drug trafficking corridors. They engaged in human smuggling, money laundering, extortion, kidnapping, murder, and gun running for over 2 decades, and had a hand in U.S. drug markets in places like Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, and many parts of Texas, as well as other areas. I will describe some of these following groups in detail, but some of the BLO allies were the Arellano Felix Organization, also known as the Tijuana Cartel, the Independent Cartel of Acapulco, the Knights Templar or Templarios, los Mazatlecos, who operated in Mazatlan, as well as in Nayarit, who were basically an armed extension of the BLO. There were los Negros, which was also a BLO enforcement squad loyal to Edgar Valdez Villarreal. There were the Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo, Special Forces of Arturo, who was one of the Beltran-Leyva brothers, which was an elite hit squad loyal to him. There was Las Oficinas de Aguascalientes in Zacatecas, which was believed to be run by Chapo Isidro, not to be confused with Chapo Guzman. There were Los Charitos, which was also a hit squad of the BLO that even had a presence in U.S. cities. There was Los Pelones de Morelos, which was once part of the BLO, but now loyal to the Gulf Cartel. There were Los Rojos in Guerrero, who were former enforcers for the BLO, but now operate independently. There were Los Guerreros Unidos in Morelos and Guerrero, Los Tequileros, which was a cell of Guerreros Unidos that specialized in extorting politicians, and others. So as you can see, there was a variety of smaller support groups of the BLO. Some of their rivals were La Familia Michoacana, which also rivaled Los Templarios, both groups who I'll get into here shortly. And they also feuded with the Gulf Cartel and later on with the Sinaloa Cartel. Things started to fall apart shortly after Hector Beltran-Leyva was arrested in October 2014. It was widely suspected that Chapo Guzman gave up information on him and the other Beltran-Leyva brothers to the government in order to secure their captures and for him to take over their territories. In apparent revenge for the arrest of their brother, Alfredo El Mochomo, in 2008, Arturo ordered the assassination of the federal police commissioner, Edgar Eusebio Millán Gómez, and other top officials in Mexico City. This was not an idle threat. They actually carried it out. He was killed on May 8, 1980, in Mexico City. One of the hitmen was soon captured, and an investigation found out there were several others involved in the plot, tied to the BLO. Arturo, a.k.a. Barbas or Botas Blancas, often held lavish parties with well-known bands playing narco corridos, such as Ramon Ayala y Los Bravos. At one time, Arturo held power that was almost equal to Chapo Guzman and Mayo Zambada, and he is said to have corrupted Noe Ramirez Mandujano, who was basically the Mexican drug czar and head of the Special Investigation of Organized Crime in Mexico. Ramirez Mandujano was arrested, but finally freed from prison in 2013. Arturo and 3 of his bodyguards were killed in December 2009 by Mexican government forces in Morelos at one of his mansions. After he was killed, some of the commandos desecrated his body by placing bloody pesos on top of him, as you can see here. This unprofessional act brought shame upon an otherwise well-run operation. A Mexican Marine who participated in the operation and who was killed was buried with military honors, but the BLO surveillance on the funeral, and the day after, some of this Marine's family, including his mother, were killed by BLO sicarios, assassins. Eventually, they figured out what was going on, and the BLO broke away from Chapo and El Mayo. They soon ordered the death of one of Chapo Guzman's sons, Edgar Guzman Lopez, which was carried out in a shopping center parking lot involving at least 15 gunmen using assault rifles and grenade launchers. Due to their feud with the Sinaloa cartel, the BLO aligned themselves with Los Zetas, who had just broken away from their parent organization, the Gulf Cartel, and were expanding rapidly out of their northeast home bases on the east coast of Mexico and all the way down to Chiapas and even Guatemala. Shortly after 2010, the BLO and Los Zetas engaged in war with the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa cartel. There was one faction of the BLO commanded by Edgar Valdez Villarreal, who was American-born and called La Barbie, sarcastically called that due to his Ken doll-like looks and dress. There was also Gerardo Alvarez Vasquez, a.k.a. El Indio, who ran Los Negros as a BLO support group. And yet another faction was run by Sergio Villarreal Barragan, a.k.a. El Grande, due to his very tall and large size. He was a former Mexican police officer. Many of these individuals were captured, as well as Beltran-Leyva brothers, which greatly diminished the organization. By 2019, it was generally accepted that the BLO was finished, although there's a few splinter groups remaining that operate on their own. La Familia Michoacana was started around the year 2000 by Carlos El Prieto Rosales Mendoza, who had been involved in drug trafficking since at least the mid-1980s. He became a good friend of Osiel Cardenas Guillen, recognized leader of the Gulf Cartel, who at the time was still using Los Zetas as his enforcement arm. Osiel even sent some Zetas to train Rosales Mendoza's supporters. At this time, the Milenio cartel, led by the Valencia brothers, were invading Michoacan. So Rosales Mendoza first formed La Empresa, later changed to La Familia Michoacan. This was done as a defense group at first, but later on they turned offensive, as many of these groups do. Rosales Mendoza was arrested in 2004, and his then number 2 guy, Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, seized control of the organization. Then severe ties with Zetas, who had recently split from the Gulf Cartel and were operating on their own. This was a time of turmoil, and a time when several La Familia Michoacana members split to form another organization called Los Templarios. Then Jose de Jesus El Chango Mendez Vargas took control of La Familia Michoacana. Today, La Familia Michoacana's territories were taken over by Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and Los Viagras. As I stated, Los Templarios was a spin-off group from La Familia Michoacana, who previously had a leader named Nazario El Mas Loco Moreno Gonzalez, who decided to form an elite group named after the famous European knights who left for the Holy Land in a crusade to retake Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire and the Arabs. Moreno Gonzalez was called El Mas Loco for a reason. He would often cite the Bible, so considered to be a Bible thumper, and he even named his bodyguards the 12 Apostles. There was a dozen of them, so basically that made him Jesus. He was killed in March 2014 in Michoacan by government forces. Another Templario leader was Servando La Tuta Gomez, who was a school teacher and very intelligent. This did not stop him from getting arrested by government forces in February 2015, whereby he was sentenced to 55 years in prison. After La Tuta was arrested, the Templarios basically collapsed. Los Viagras was another spin-off group in Michoacan. They were led by Nicolas El Gordo Sierra Santana, and were started in 2014, about the time that Templarios and La Familia Michoacana were fizzling out. The name allegedly came from hair gel used by some of the younger members, whereby their hair stood up stiff. They also began as a self-defense group, and allegedly were supported by local government authorities in order to capture La Tuta, leader of Los Templarios. After the capture of La Tuta, local authorities tried to get Los Viagras to disband, but they did not, and there was a violent clash. Los Viagras also began to take on Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, who were invading the area under orders of El Mencho. But the CJNG were at a disadvantage, as Los Viagras were locals and knew the terrain. So even though they were much smaller than the CJNG, they held their own. Los Exilados, the exiled ones, is a new group led by a former lieutenant for the Sinaloa cartel named Carlos Enrique Martinez Cuesta, who was a former Mexican Marine, so he was known as El Marino, or M5, as his code name. Many people in Mexico and the United States today consider the current president of Mexico, AMLO's policies, to be a failure. His kill the cartels with kindness, brazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets, has not worked very well.
Right now, we have a very appeasement-oriented government in Mexico with AMLO. In fact, if you take a look at one catalyst, one watershed event that one can point to where the drug cartels had morphed into a narco state in control of Mexico, it was October 17th, 2019, when the Mexican government set out to capture Ovidio Guzman, also known as El Capito, one of the three Chapito's sons of Chapo Guzman. And the Mexican military forces, with a very sophisticated operation, did in fact capture Ovidio Guzman. But almost immediately, the Sinaloa drug cartel responded with such a violent, overwhelming paramilitary counterassault that it ended up being excuse the pun, a Mexican standoff, where the president of Mexico himself, AMLO, stepped in and ordered his own troops to surrender and cough up the prisoner. Now, such a stunning decision that he came to, saying we do not want war with the cartels, failing to realize he's already in one, had, in my opinion, just led to the surrender of an entire sovereign nation to the thugs and desperados. Just like the warlords in Afghanistan, it's the narco-terrorists running things in Mexico today.
But largely due to U.S. pressure, Ovidio was recaptured in January 2023. And just like the first time, his sicarios tried to take the city hostage and fired upon Mexican forces as well as civilians. But this time, Ovidio was kept in custody. As I stated in the Mexican Drug Trafficking Organization's introduction, despite many well-publicized cases of police corruption going all the way to the top in the government of Mexico, there are good cops there, and they need our support, and they should have the Mexican government support. The Mexican federal government not only failed many times in securing individuals like Ovidio, there are many times where its general policy on drugs have failed. And much of this, I believe, is due to the denial and misunderstandings by AMLO of the current situations in Mexico. He and many of his supporters have worked to conceal the violence that has plagued his country. He states that the drug cartels control no part of Mexico, given the reason that there's no place in Mexico where there are not police forces patrolling. But this does not mean they haven't been corrupted or compromised or scared of local drug cartels that can outgun them. While there are also many parts of the U.S. that seem out of control, in large part due to soft-on-crime approaches by politicians here, homicide rates in Mexico are epidemic. It is hard sometimes to even classify crimes as a homicide, as many people are just desaparecidos, disappeared, and their bodies are never found. So this is like a missing persons case in the United States, but there are far more in Mexico, and seldom are the cases solved and bodies found. Many times the cartels will disappear people in vats of acid, which are steel drums containing acid that will turn people into a muck, commonly called pozole, after a popular Mexican soup. Often their bodies are burned beyond recognition. Dr. Hiram Sanchez Beltran is a researcher at UCLA, and he published an article in 2016 on the impact of homicides in Mexico. He states that the problem we have in Mexico with the murder rate is that there is a constant struggle to know if the information is appropriate and whether they are codifying it, masking the information. However, the current reality in that country is the impact on life expectancy is much lower than it should be. And because we know that all deaths are classified differently, even though they are actually murders. But it seems the dead will never be counted accurately in Mexico in the near future. So we just don't know. The drug war in Mexico is one of the world's most violent ongoing conflicts that has only become worse over the last 5.5 decades. Its impact on the Mexican economy and society has increased virtually every year, in spite of occasional victories taking down a drug lord or busting up a cartel. Drug activity has affected many industries, like the tourism industry. To be frank, many Americans are and should be scared to go there, even in previously safe places like Cancun and Puerto Vallarta. It is estimated that drugs pump at least $50 billion into the Mexican economy each year. And in spite of overhead costs, Mexican drug cartels can expect an 80% profit margin doing business there. Even more recently, AMLO gave a speech in March 2023 on the Zocalo, the main plaza or public square in Mexico City, located between the Mexican Palace, which is the equivalent of our White House, and the large and well-respected Basilica of La Virgen de Guadalupe, which is the patron saint of Mexico. AMLO claimed in this speech that his country does not produce or consume fentanyl, despite enormous evidence to the contrary. He seemed very intent on stroking national pride and vocalizing their autonomy as an independent nation, while depicting synthetic opioid use as being a U.S. problem, and basically stated that the U.S. should stay out of Mexico's business and use family values to fight American drug addiction problems. But in actuality, there's little debate in the U.S. and by most Mexican drug experts that most all of fentanyl, which is an increasing drug used in new fads like tranq, are produced and tracked back to Mexico. While on the face of things, Mexican consumption of fentanyl may be relatively low right now compared to the United States, this is largely because the Mexican drug cartels make a far larger profit in the United States and have had little reason to try to create a market in Mexico. But once the market is saturated in the United States, this does not mean they will not try to do so in Mexico and in other countries. They have always found ways to make money. And individuals like Abraham Serrano, director of Latin American projects for the U.S. State Department, who is originally from Mexico City, states that there's been a 500% growth in the consumption of fentanyl and methamphetamine in Mexico since 2013. And overdoses since 2019 have increased 200%. So Mexico is not immune, Mr. President of Mexico. In any place on earth, supply and demand in politics often drive drug cartels. I have heard some people state that what Mexico needs is another revolution. Be careful what you ask for. The last time a revolution occurred in Mexico, from roughly 1910 to 1925, there were approximately 1 million people killed there, and another 1 million fled across the border into the United States. Now you have to take in consideration the population of Mexico at that time was only about 10 million. Today it is over 100 million. So let's put that in perspective. Today that would mean approximately 10 million deaths in Mexico and another 10 million flooding the border into the United States. The impact on this country would be devastating. I've also heard some people stating that we should just invade Mexico and take over. This is a terrible idea. This would just give an excuse for the Russians to explain why they invaded Ukraine or why China should invade Taiwan. Sometimes I don't know how some of these politicians even got elected. We would be much better off supporting the good police officers and military that are in Mexico now, giving them better pay and better training and better recruitment. In fact, the same thing goes for our police and military forces here. We would be much better off finding better solutions to stem the tide of drugs entering our country and for treatment of low-level drug users. It should be not all stick. We don't need to lock them up for long periods of time. They are sick, but it can't be all carrot too. There should be penalty for not going through drug treatment. So what I'm saying is Mexico's drug problem is not going away anytime soon. Neither is America's. I hope you learned some new things from these videos and that you continue to keep up to date on Mexican drug cartels and other criminal organizations by watching this channel. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.